Aloha mai kako. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Micah Fisher, and I'm a research fellow at the East-West Center. On behalf of Dr. Miriam Stark at the University of Hawaii Center for Southeast Asian Studies, our co-organizers at Michigan State University, the East-West Center, Chiang Mai University, and the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome everyone to this webinar on migrations, labor, and smallholder livelihoods. We want to send a special thanks of gratitude to the Luce Foundation for its support of our ongoing collaborations, and we invite anyone in the audience who would like to know more about our work or the webinar series to reach out to us. This co-hosted webinar series on Southeast Asia in transition has been ongoing for more than 2 years. The event today follows on themes that have arisen in our previous webinars on water justice, palm oil plantationization of Southeast Asia, migrations and mobilities in the region, spiritual landscapes and forest rights, and many, many others. The links to these webinars will be placed in the chat for all viewers to access. To this end, our panel tonight will extend many of those fruitful discussions. And this year's panel, we've been really focused around smallholders. So we're building from a theme that began a couple of weeks ago, where we were discussing how the lives and livelihoods and landscapes of smallholders have been changing. And today's session about migration, I think, is particularly connected to our previous discussion. So without further delay, I'm very pleased to introduce you all to this panel. First, we will have Dr. ChristinaGriffin, a fellow from the University of Melbourne. Also, Dr. AmandaFlaim, assistant professor of Michigan State University Sociology and James Madison College, and Nasrullah from Universitas Mula Warman in Indonesia, currently pursuing his PhD at University of Malaysia. As a way to begin, I'll first invite each of the panelists to provide introductions of themselves and talk about how their work intersects with concerns of our theme in today's discussion around migration, livelihoods, and labor. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. ChristinaGriffin.
Great, thanks, Micah. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this really interesting panel. So my name is ChristinaGriffin. I'm a research fellow at the University of Melbourne. I did my PhD at the ANU, and during that time I looked at vulnerability to volcanic hazards, so how rural communities negotiate risk and move in and out of agrarian spaces. At the moment, I've been fortunate enough to work alongside Micah and an amazing team of researchers at the Unhas in Makassar. And we've been working on a pair-funded project, which is through the Australian Indonesian Centre, looking at youth livelihood aspirations and struggles in the context of agrarian change in South Sulawesi. So what I'm talking about today is this real collaboration between a whole lot of researchers across these organisations. So our study site here is situated in South Sulawesi, and this is an area that's really undergoing rapid transitions. The picture here shows these large-scale agrarian changes that are occurring. We have this rice farming land, and behind that you can see the construction of what is a really large railway line. And so this is really this sort of expansion of the port in nearby Makassar, construction of this railway line. It's really changing the way young people access livelihood opportunities and whether they can remain on the farm or whether they're searching opportunities further abroad. So I'm going to briefly just run through the stories of 3 young people that we spoke with as part of this research. And this will give a sort of a bit of a background on the different types of mobility that young people are engaging with. So we're starting here with a young girl called Intan. This isn't her real name, from a coastal fishing and aquaculture village in Padjukukang. So Intan, like many people in this village, she would follow her family for 6 months of each year, and they would move to Kalimantan to work on fishing vessels. And then they would return for the other 6 months to Pajukukang. Intan now works in a factory nearby in Makassar. So she commutes each day into Makassar to find work in a shrimp processing factory. And yeah, well, I mean, we'll discuss this sort of later in the questions, but there have been challenges for Intan living this life between Kalimantan and South Sulawesi. And one of those is this disconnection from schools. It can be quite costly and difficult to keep changing schools all the time. And so as a result of these sort of issues, Intan feels that her biggest aspiration would be to work in a retail store like Alphamart. But she thinks only those that have high school can achieve this. So people like me, we have to find work in the manufacturing district in Makassar or continue to travel to Kalimantan. The next story is a man called Saharudin, and he's in the sort of the outskirts of Makassar in a village called Pelantikang. And this is sort of a more rapidly urbanizing area. Saharudin, like many of the people in his village, has been involved in lots of periods of migration to Papua. There's big communities of people from South Sulawesi, particularly in Jayapura, and they work as marketplace traders, fishermen on plantations, drivers, and they sort of follow this pre-existing social network and community and established there. Saharudin has since returned to Pelantikang because his mother is unwell and he wants to keep her company. He comes from a family who doesn't own land, and so he still thinks that those earnings that he's made in Papua would be better spent back in Papua renting boats, and he doesn't have aspirations to use that money to buy land in his village, and this is because this land isn't known to have particularly good yielding crops. And so the final story is that of a young girl called Sita who lives up in the hinterland in Barugai. And so this is an agricultural village that borders a national park. Sita comes from a family who own land, and she has strong attachments to this land, and she remembers helping working that land when she was a child. Barugai is the site of outmigration. It has been for decades, and a lot of people in this village travel to Saudi Arabia to work as domestic helpers, or they might also go to plantations in Kalimantan. Sita, however, has decided that she doesn't want to migrate, and she wants to stay close to home and continue to help her family with agricultural work. So at the moment, she is studying a teaching degree in Makassar, but she still returns home every few weeks and during during semester break, to help her parents with that farming responsibility. And she hopes that one day she will also be able to inherit land in this village. So these three stories that I've just shown very briefly show that there are many forms of mobility that young people in South Sulawesi engage in, and they cut across class, gender, and also geographic location. And Fundi Ahmed made this amazing map for us that just shows the complexity of migration pathways. We see Maros and all the areas that people from Maros travel out to. And even within the district of Maros, there's a lot of movement going on. Yeah, so it's just a useful visual for us. And again, I think we'll touch on this later, but there's a real connect in this situation between migration and new conditions of precarity. So a lot of these stories show that migration can reduce rural vulnerability and support upward class mobility. Yet many of the stories also come with difficulties and challenges. And we see women being exposed to domestic violence in Saudi Arabia, insecure work contracts, poor working conditions, high living costs in destination sites, and as Intan's stories shows, disruption to education. So these are just a brief overview of some of the costs of that migration. So I think that's all for me at this stage.
Thanks so much. I want to now, thanks for giving us just the complexity and telling us the different stories and how dynamic this story of migration and the way it's changing these landscapes. I want to follow one of those strands now from that last map that you showed and introduce or give the opportunity for Nasrullah to introduce his work, moving to a much more cultural studies, humanities perspective on the history of migration and how that connects with some of the stories that Christina was just sharing. Nasrullah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Micah. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for the chance, ISWES Center and all of the panelists of this discussion. This is my presentation about migration, labor, and smallholder livelihood from Sulawesi to Kalimantan, Indonesia. And I am Nasrullah from East Kalimantan, especially in Samarinda, but origin from South Sulawesi. I am a part of these topics about the migration, smallholders, and livelihoods. And I will present about how the South Sulawesi people, like Christina told before, migrate to East Kalimantan. This in migration studies called as internal displaced migration. Now I am the PhD student in Department of Social Culture and Arts in University of Malaya, Malaysia, and study about the environmental history and post-colonial ecology, and also relate to the migration and labor system. Okay, I will discuss about the historical perspective, how the people from South Sulawesi migrate to eastern of the Kalimantan, from the Sulawesi or Celebes Island to Kalimantan Island, and cross border from Makassar Strait in Indonesia. I will contextualize migration dynamics from a historical perspective, and transformation and change, of course, how the smallholders migrate to Kalimantan and change their livelihoods. And this is the history of how people of South Sulawesi, especially Buginese and Makassaris, come to Kalimantan, of course, in the eastern coast of Kalimantan, that call of the East Kalimantan province. There are 3 steps or 4 about how they are migrate. First of all, in the colonial era, in the VOC, Verenigde Indische Company, and Makassar War in the 7th century. This is the first big numbers of migrants come to Kalimantan and all over the Indonesian or Nusantara archipelago. And the second one is the riots from the ITI, Darul Islam, and Indonesian Islamic Army in from 1950 until 1965. This is the cause, the riots as the driving factors that enforce people from South Sulawesi doing migrate to East Kalimantan and all over the islands, and also in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaysia and Singapore. And the third one is about contemporary migration. This is not about the war or the riots again, but this is about the attraction of economic factors from the timber industry, oil and gas booming effects, coal mining labors, and palm oil plantation labors until nowadays. And they call this part as economy and livelihoods as driving and attraction factors, where the first and second are the riots and war as the factors that enforce people from South Sulawesi migrate to East Kalimantan, and also the part of islands in Indonesian archipelago and Southeast Asia. And like Christina's show us before, this is where the destinations of South Sulawesi migrants, labor migrants also come to all over the part of the archipelago in Indonesia, especially also in Southeast Asia, where in Malaysia also, eastern of Malaysia, where I stay here now. And in this presentation, I will focus on eastern of Kalimantan, especially in Samarinda and some of the little city in the eastern coast of Kalimantan, and how they migrate, the people of South Sulawesi migrate to the Kalimantan, and how the relationship between the smallholders and livelihoods. This is the destinations, and this is the some riots where mostly the second wave of migration in South Sulawesi come to the other parts of Indonesia. And this is EDPs, internal displaced people, where the people from South Sulawesi become the displaced people, where when they come to the other province or island in this archipelagos. And also we can see the South Sulawesi, the number of 24 and 25, the South Sulawesi and South East Sulawesi from Sulawesi Tenggara also is the big numbers of internal displaced people in Indonesia. And this is the ethnicity where the Buginese and Makassaris, of course, also is the one ethnic that doing migrate in the big numbers since in 1961 until nowadays. This is the data from year 1979. And the second one about the migration of in Indonesia, beside of the first one is the migrant because the conflict. They are called as a frontiers or all migrants. This is the migrants workers that come to Kalimantan that enforcing by riots in origins. Mostly didn't plan to return, and they are mostly not returning. And these people create new identities like Samarinda Buginese, Kalimantan Buginese, and also Balikpapan Buginese. This is some place in eastern of Kalimantan. They are assimilated also and integrated to the local people or indigenous people in Kalimantan, in Borneo, but in a relationship that this relate to the these topics for today about because they are clearing forests for farming livelihoods. This is the frontiers of all migrants. And what is about the new migrants or contemporary migrants from South Sulawesi to Kalimantan? This is a trade by the timber industry, oil and gas, coal mining, and palm oil plantations, and also the rise of shrimp commodities demand in global market. And they are is the sharecroppers in hometown, of course. And this is how economy and livelihoods as driving and attraction factors of the migration. And this is the picture how the people from South Sulawesi, including from Maros, of course, and from Mekampung in Bone in the eastern coast of South Sulawesi, come to the Kalimantan using the big ships in Indonesia called ferry or pelni. Ferry is the little small ship, but pelni is and also the private ship, but pelni is the state owners of the ship that can transport the people from Sulawesi to Kalimantan. And this is the port of Samarinda, and this is the port of Samarinda also, and this is in Parepare in the western coast of South Sulawesi, where the people from South Sulawesi start their migration from this port. And also another port of South Sulawesi is Makassar, the site of Parepare. And beside the new migrants, the contemporary migrants, there is a new migrants also, or in Bahasa we call as perantau, newcomers from eastern of Kalimantan that come from South Sulawesi. Those who are called as new migrants or perantau baru, they are as traders, labor and new farmers come from Parepare to Samarinda and Balikpapan labor in logging and timber industries, clearing forests for small plantation, farming, and clearing mangrove in Mahakam deltas and Berau deltas, especially in Kelai and especially in Kelai and Segah River Delta in Berau Regency. As labor via Baru seaport to Bontang, this is the new port that that can the starting point from South Sulawesi come to Kalimantan, the new port from Baru to Bontang. So beside Parepare and Makassar, there's new port in Baru and also close from Maros and the western coast of South Sulawesi. This is the port where the traders and new laborers in coal mining and palm oil plantation start their migration process into the eastern of Kalimantan. Okay, and how about the impact to origins and destination? All of the migrants left their smallholder livelihoods in their hometown, of course, and to be displaced people for the all migrants and encourage internal migration phenomena in Indonesia, impacting deforestation with clearing the forest and also the mangrove in Mahakam deltas and Berau deltas for new farming, small plantation, and shrimp ponds. And this is the pictures how the shrimp ponds in Mahakam deltas and also the small mining in around the Mahakam delta, especially in eastern of Kalimantan, is the coal mining representation in the eastern of Kalimantan, where the people from Sulawesi work also in this point. And contemporary migrants, I call as the skilled and unskilled or educated and uneducated migrants, and also they are the how to say the informal livelihoods in their destinations.
Nasrullah, can I jump in a little bit, because we're going to get back to this in the discussion section.
Okay, I think that's all, Micah, for me. Thank you.
I think these are really important themes that we'll definitely be covering through the panel discussion. I do want to acknowledge just how it thank you so much for sharing that it's part of your own experience as well, right? Being a migrant, having gone through those migration channels, speaking to the different motivations for migration that Christina was articulating from these places in South Sulawesi, and just the breadth and the scope of where people are going, as well as the different conditions to which they migrate. It's really interesting, situating it in a historical perspective, and we definitely want to hear a lot more about that. I want to give the floor to Dr. AmandaFlaim to share a little bit about how these sorts of dynamics are playing out in very different regions across Southeast Asia. Amanda, take it away.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Nasrullah and Christina, I'm honored to be here with you. And I'm going to talk about field sites, particularly in northern Thailand, but I'll draw a bit on some work that I've been doing in southern Thailand, and then also increasingly in Cambodia and Laos. The transformations that you're talking about, of course, resonate very closely with the work that I've been doing. So we've all been talking about migration and mobility and kind of haunting these discussions as a question of displacement and land. And so before I say anything else, I just want to thank my hosts at MSU. I'm standing on the traditional and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe peoples, who are the Three Fires Confederacy of Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe people. So I need to recognize that the work that I do here is built on a long legacy of 400 years of land theft on this continent. And what I witness in my research in Southeast Asia are very similar dynamics, unfortunately. And also, I think what I'll talk about now, sort of pivoting to that work, is some of the incredible global solidarities across Indigenous communities and with researchers at Southeast Asian institutions that I'm aware of, as well as in Western institutions that are addressing these issues. So including Nasrullah and Christina. I'm going to draw in here in Northern Thailand, and as another brief thank you, I need to just amplify a voice and a research collaborator and partner and sister of mine who really helped me understand that I was approaching many of my questions in Southeast Asia entirely the wrong way. So Chutima Miju is Chutima is her Thai name. That's her legal name. That's what the name she was required to take when she had her Thai citizenship recognized. She's an Akha woman and was one of the several formative and extremely courageous leaders of the Highland citizenship movement in Thailand, which I'll talk about in a bit. And I had 20 years ago moved to Thailand I had moved from UNICEF and I was working at the UNESCO office in Bangkok on a very well-intentioned and not terribly well-informed project on anti-trafficking. And there was billions of dollars being spent to teach Highland people to love their daughters and not sell them for heroin or a refrigerator. And as one of my other teachers and partners on this project reminded us, was that they weren't doing this. In fact, none of them had even considered it. And even though they were being taught not to. So, she was the one who said, you're thinking about the UN and these projects are thinking about these issues entirely wrong. And if you want to think about migration, you want to talk about unsafe migration, trafficking, and labor exploitation, we need to talk about people's relationship to land and our livelihoods and how they've been changing. So any stage I get to occupy, I need to send a huge thank you to her for being a teacher and collaborator. So I dropped what I was doing. I started graduate school and did 2 years of ethnographic work and survey work in the Highlands. And I'm showing you these ridiculous pie charts, not because they make sense, but to give you a sense of in this area, just the tremendous ethno-linguistic diversity of the region. So when Thais and folks who work in mainland Southeast Asia think about the Highlands, they tend to think about extraordinary cultural diversity. The other issue that I raised is that the Highlands in Thailand is a site of ongoing structural violence and statelessness. So Thailand is the only country in mainland Southeast Asia that has systematically deprived Highland people born in the country of citizenship. This has changed. So having done work now in the region for almost 20 years, the situation of statelessness has changed quite a bit. Migration has changed, and it's changed Thailand and Thai national relationships to the uplands, but also the uplands as well. And this picture was actually taken by Miju. I was not even working on this at the time in 1999, when Highlanders bravely occupied one of the lawns in Chiang Mai, calling for citizenship and land rights. And actually, I should mention that they did this occupation in violation of the law, because not simply that they went and sat in front of, a state house, but at this moment, very few people, in fact, fewer than half Highland people had citizenship, were recognized as Thai citizens. So leaving their village was illegal at the time. And the fact that they walked or rode motorbikes or rode in the back of pickup trucks to get down to this area in Chiang Mai, the fact that it even occurred was an incredible violation of a law about who is allowed to move and how. So it's something I'll come back to. I'm showing these 3 pictures to give us a sense, I think, maybe to amplify a bit about what Nasrullah and Christina were mentioning earlier about how sites that are often spoken about from urban centers as remote rural sites, that they're sites of incredible global connection and change. So I'm actually going to ask us to look from the picture to the right, where my friend, this gentleman, is walking in his field, and then we'll move to this picture of the grandmother and this adorable baby, and then to my friend serving coffee from an extraordinary coffee maker that she bought from Italy. So when I started doing my work, many of the fields where I was working, there was no paved roads into the communities. And still moving from the villages up into the land that they're farming, people are often walking or riding motorbikes. At the time, because statelessness, this is about 15 years ago, because statelessness was still quite pervasive as a barrier for people to simply get recognition of fundamental rights. So to be able to go to school, to get access to scholarships, to go to school, to leave the district legally, You're not allowed, until very recently, people without Thai citizenship were not legally allowed to leave their districts without threat of being perhaps imprisoned, certainly bribed, and I'll get to a bit about the internal borderscape. But it created this sense of immobility, like a lack of the capacity to move. And the reasons why people wanted to move, of course, ring true with what Christina was saying, which was people want to go to school, but it's of course hard to go to school. It becomes more expensive to go to school. And then increasingly they wanted to move. So 15 years ago, people were leaving the village, moving to areas like Bangkok or urban centers and working sometimes in domestic work if they were women, as men working in part-time construction. People were moving, but increasingly as they, in a newer generation, so people now in their 30s, started moving to go to school. Highland communities, for various reasons, don't have excellent schools if they have schools at all. And Highland parents are quite knowledgeable about this. So they would send their kids quite far away at times. Sometimes I would meet families who would send their kids all the way to Bangkok if they could get their kids into a school very far away. And once those kids would go to school, you have a family situation like this image here in the middle. The grandmother here was a very generous person to me when I did my field work ages ago. And her son had married this wonderful woman from a different community, both Aka people. And the young woman, after she had this sweet little baby boy, she was very excited because she had acquired recognition of her Thai citizenship, which enabled her to get her passport, and she had been working on studying Korean. So what's transpired in the last 5.5 years is a remarkable exodus, kind of shocking exodus from the villages, not necessarily to Bangkok or to Kuala Lumpur, but actually increasingly to Seoul, Korea, working in factories, men and women. And in this case, the mother left and the son stayed home. She recently came home, and now the father of this little boy is just got a visa to Japan. So their plans are increasingly to go for 2 to 3 years and come back. The story over here is also kind of remarkable, and that is that in an area of the Highlands, which was also known, imagined in, Thai and Western kind of imaginaries as, dangerous, remote sites of opium production, it turns out to be extremely productive coffee fields. And since I started my work 10 years ago on thinking about, increasingly moving from explicitly migration-related work to thinking about the connection between migration and land, my friends, people of my generation, are increasingly becoming quite successful entrepreneurs in coffee production. And this is not to say, however, Nasrullah, your points about the plantationization of the economy in other kinds of crops that can't be intercropped, like coffee is popular now because it can be intercropped with other food products. Other kinds of, rubber and other palm oil, bananas, those are also being produced. But coffee is sort of occupying in the Highlands this new imaginary as a space where people can practice modernity, and participate in a kind of cosmopolitan life. So Highland communities and youth who were discriminated against by teachers and Thai people for being sort of, I'm using quotes here, like backwards Indigenous people, extremely discriminatory and derogatory kind of terms talking about Highland Indigenous people in Thailand. Now, as some of these villages are extraordinary tiny little cities where youth who have college educations, like this young woman here, who speaks fluent Chinese as well as fluent English. She was actually an au pair in North Carolina until Trump ended that program. Now are running these extremely cosmopolitan coffee shops in upland communities where people are still, walking into the field every day. So this transformation has been quite remarkable. The last thing I'll just very quickly mention that I pointed to earlier is this internal borderscape and the kind of precarities that are introduced by the state before we saw more global migrations outside of, not just in the region, but from perhaps upland communities to the States or to China or to Korea. What you're seeing in these two images, the top image is an internal checkpoint. If you're traveling through northern Thailand, you will cross them. I think there are 15 Sometimes they're manned, most often they're not, but intermittently they tend to be manned by military police with large guns, where people of various documentation statuses can be shaken down, and women in particular are at risk of sexual exploitation or violence in these sites, because if they're pulled off a bus or they're isolated, those are sites where basically they don't have control. So it's quite terrifying for people about moving through this landscape. And the other site here, which looks quite innocuous, it says Ampho Yim, which means the district that smiles. And every district office in Thailand has these kind of welcoming images where people are supposed to come and file applications to basically move for work, move for, get passports, to file, even to move from one house to another, legally. Haunting all of that, I think, and I'll just stop with there, is a broader kind of commentary when we think about migration and mobility, about who gets to move and how. Highland people in northern Thailand, Swidden farmers traditionally were mobile, and that practice of mobility became criminalized, and the livelihoods became criminalized. It was only when the state required them to sedentarize formally and begin a kind of economic productivity that was seen as moral and within a framework of potential taxation, did the question of people being able to move in a different kind of way rise. So I hope that was helpful, and I'm really excited to connect with everyone else on the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda. Those are such complex and introductions with so much depth of engagement, and it's really great to see all these stories and trying to kind of wrap my head around the similarities around such different geographies and what compels people to migrate, what is changing in these places. We agreed on a set of questions, so for the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to stick around. I'm sure there's a lot that we can go into further depth around, but I want to start with Christina and go through a set of questions. The first is, how is migration changing livelihoods and landscapes at the point of origin, and how is it impacting destinations? Now, I know Christina and Nasrullah, it's kind of a complementary answer. So if you choose to focus on the points of origin, please go ahead, and Nasrullah can pick up thereafter.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Micah. Yeah, and thank you, Amanda and Nasrullah. They were amazing talks. Yeah, so I guess Nasrullah and our research kind of complements each other. So I might just talk about that changing livelihoods and landscapes in the origin. So I guess when our research team spoke to people about migration, we found that initially sort of migration was a means to sort of support upward class mobility. So it might have allowed education of children, pilgrimages to Mecca, and the purchase of land. And we particularly saw these sort of trends in our highland villages, sort of in the highlands of the Maros district. Currently, maybe the stories that we sort of heard more frequently, that a lot of migration nowadays is maybe a little bit more driven out of economic necessity. If we remember, I spoke about those stories of youth. Some people felt that migration was really the only way to access a reasonable salary and livelihood activity. Yeah, I guess we don't have firm information or data on how much that is actually paying. But we did hear a lot of complaints that maybe some of these opportunities, they didn't quite live up to expectations. Yeah, so I guess that sort of, it can, I guess it depends. It's differentiated across so many different factors, class and gender just being some of them, that it can support, it can support rural development and progression and purchase of farmland, but that certainly isn't the case for everyone. So maybe Nasrullah wants to expand on that in terms of the destination site. I think we couldn't quite unfortunately, our research didn't extend to East Kalimantan. So it's really wonderful to be on this panel with you so that we can learn about that aspect of.
Okay, so it's a really interesting connection, right, between these motivations for migration in a place like South Sulawesi, where it was about buying up land or different crop booms that were transforming these landscapes. But the landscape in East Kalimantan that Nasrullah is familiar with is completely different. So can you talk a little bit about how much land has changed along the Mahakam River, Nasrullah, how shrimp farming and mining has really transformed the landscape there, and how smallholders have reshaped their livelihoods?
Okay, thank you, Micah, Christina, and Amanda. I'm working for University of Mula Warna for late 5 years, and I migrate also from South Sulawesi and doing I call a self-ethnography about how the migrant worker from South Sulawesi come to East Kalimantan and how they change, especially the smallholder and livelihoods. I identified that there is 3 parts or types of the migrants from South Sulawesi. First is the educated migrants like me, of course, and my friends and some of my senior. And the second one is the uneducated, and the unskilled labor that come from South Sulawesi. Most of them are the sharecroppers, workers, small farmers or smallholders in South Sulawesi come to Kalimantan as the mining workers or mining labor, especially in coal mining. And also some of them work as the shrimp ponds, small farmers, and also they become the sharecroppers from the other owners, the big owners of the shrimp ponds in Mahakam deltas, and they are a small group to be the coal pirates in the downstream of Mahakam, where they can steal the coal from the big ship that transport the coal, meaning the coal from the upstream to the downstream or the mouth of Mahakam and the Makassar Strait. And also they are the one characteristic of the South Sulawesi migrants to Eastern Kalimantan is they establish a small shop that in Samarinda called as the warung daeng, like the small shop that sell many consumer goods. And also the main characteristic is this shop from the Buginese people open for 20 hours. And also I think 7-Eleven or the Alpha Mart or other the mart, modern mart in Samarinda or Eastern Kalimantan don't open 24 hours. And the migrant from South Sulawesi come to Kalimantan to establish these livelihoods, the small shop, and also they are the trader in the traditional market and also in night market in Kalimantan called as Pasar Malam. There are many locations in every night, especially in Samarinda, where the Pasar Malam or night market is established, and most of them is the trader in this Pasar Malam or in this night market is the Buginese or come from South Sulawesi, beside the Banjaris and also the Japanese and local traders. And this is the chain of livelihoods from the sharecroppers in South Sulawesi become the coal mining labor, and also the independent traders or the the small traders in eastern of Kalimantan. And the other one that relate to the landscape change, the all migrants that call as the frontiers is the people who are clearing the forest for their livelihoods activities, especially in small small farmers in eastern of Kalimantan. But the contemporary migrants or the new migrants mostly work as the mining workers and also the independent traders in Pasar Malam and Warung Daik. I think that's all, Micah. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And the class dimensions are really, I think, stark in these examples. So thanks for sharing that. I imagine that the building of a capital city right in between Samarinda and Balikpapan has really drove the extent of migration to the region, not just from South Sulawesi, but a great deal of Javanese coming through the region. And I really think it's important the way that you think historically in terms of the periods and these new types of migrants tied to landlessness and things like that and the points of origin. Really interesting. Amanda, I want to turn now to you. Those three stories that you provided us were so vivid, and especially where they're headed. Can you comment a bit on this question?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to highlight just briefly is that an unfortunate story that's arisen with the broader mobility networks for labor and school, et cetera, is debt. So people go into sometimes extraordinary debt to be able to move in order to get, brokers to find work in cities, in other countries. The labor broker work in Thailand typically targets Burmese or Cambodian workers coming into Thailand, but there are folks who come from poorer rural areas that they also focus on and sometimes do sort of predatory lending and labor brokering to get them visas, et cetera, out of the country. So debt seems to be an issue that is really growing, although it goes hand in hand with what also looks like a kind of conspicuous wealth accumulation in terms of transformation of the origin cities or the origin villages, right? I mean, it also cannot be denied that the material conditions of the communities where people who have been so generous to allow me to spend time in these communities and do work in solidarity with them, that the conditions of life in these communities in terms of water availability, water heaters, et cetera, roof materials, things like that are more durable, and people tend to enjoy that, but it does go hand in hand with debt. It's also sort of changed family structures and family dynamics in the ways that I understand, particularly, in the Philippines, where we see so many women leaving, in the highlands of Thailand and parts of understanding in Isan, Thailand, because often men are staying home and women are leaving. Women are getting much higher education and then find work elsewhere, that it is changing kind of family structure, child rearing practices. And in a paper that I worked on, because this was the main concern of the communities where I worked, they said, you need to write about elderly. And the concerns about the fact that, not only are we finding like everywhere that older people are living longer, which is wonderful, but also they tend to be living more alone, which people find devastating because their kids are moving away. Also in this paper and in the research, we found that elderly people, particularly those who don't have recognition of their citizenship, are doing wage labor, like quite degrading and difficult, very hard wage labor in agricultural fields for other people. So we see a much bigger fragmentation in origin sites. The last thing to sort of mention on origins is that the need for labor in highland communities hasn't changed. In fact, it's grown. And it's being filled by undocumented Burmese migrants and refugees, often Burmese only by nationality or Myanmarese only by nationality. They tend also to be indigenous ethnic minority people, or Shan. And there are new villages being founded next to formal official villages that are essentially labor camps for Highland communities, and I think I forgot to mention this at the beginning, which is really critical, that Highlanders don't have land rights. So you have often sometimes stateless, landless people who rely on usufruct claims to land, employing in very precarious ways people who are hyper surveilled by the state. In terms of destinations, I haven't been able to go and see where they're working in Korea factories, but what has been really interesting in Chiang Mai and Bangkok is an attitude and growing attitude change. And I don't know, I haven't interrogated it quite as much, but I think it's in part related to the ways that Highland people captured foreign and Thai imaginaries, as I'm using again quotes here. I'm not saying that this is true, but the ways that Highlanders were conceived as colorful people, that they became sort of initially a tourist attraction, and now increasingly it's like almost all the coffee companies across Bangkok and in Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai in particular highlight Indigenous women's costumes in their marketing. So there's also a kind of attitude change about Highland people and Highland women in particular, partly I suppose in relationship to their growing participation as seen as like a moral participation in a formal economy. I don't know if that helps, but yeah, I wanted to highlight the debt part. As devastating as it is, it does seem to be a considerable issue related to migration.
I think it's a really important point, and I know that that's true in the other contexts as well, between land, debt, in search of livelihoods. I want to move on to, and we have about 9 minutes left before we open it up to question and answers from the larger pool of attendees today. But I just, and this is a reminder for those who want to ask a question, we do allocate a lot of time for Q&A, so please drop your questions in the chat. I want to shift gears a little bit to this question of methods, right? A lot of us are researchers, and I think some of the more traditional studies of agrarian change and how rural places are changing, really struggle to put to address this question of migration. And this discussion today has been so rich. So, for aspiring graduate students, or for your colleagues who are just wrestling with this issue, do you have any recommendations or ideas about how to take on methods like this? What have you learned in trying to connect very different geographies, very different contexts, gender, class, generation, as really important components of this? Do you have advice in taking that methods question on? Let's start with same routine. Let's go with Christina first.
Sure, thanks, Micah. That's a great question. I probably don't have a single easy answer. But certainly as we've been looking at migration, it is just so complex, as we all know. So the reasons, the push and pull factors, it varies so much across gender, class, and generation. So trying to have that kind of intersectional understanding of the issues at play, that's probably easier said than done. It's quite challenging. We've also, I guess we've also found that in the work we've been doing across this landscape, that the issues are quite different from one village to another. So the destination sites, the reasons people migrate, they can vary quite considerably. So that's been a bit of a challenge for our research as well, trying to understand that comprehensively. I guess I should also mention that a lot of the work that I've been talking about today, I mean, it's a real collaboration, particularly with UNHAS, University of Melbourne, and Micah. And so we've been working, a lot of the field work was done during the COVID, in between sort of heightened periods of COVID and the pandemic. And so that's been a real challenge trying to access the field at all. We relied a lot on remote field work, a lot of incredible amount of Zoom meetings that Micah and UNHAS will remember. So I guess that's been, just another sort of methodological challenge was just basically accessing the field safely during that period of time. Yes, I think it's also just a challenge, that connection between the origin and the destination site. And so that's why this is fabulous to meet with Nasrul and to learn about his work in the destination sites. And I guess that's something for future sort of researchers to consider, how they can spread their time across that, because I think you get a different perspective from where you are. We tended to hear the stories of people that had returned, and less of the stories of the people that had stayed, obviously.
That's a really important point. Thanks for sharing that, and great work on the collaboration stuff, especially accessing very different classes and different types of populations from these places. Nasrullah, you have a really unique insight into methods, right? You actually got on these boats and went with these migrants. So do you have insights for us in terms of studying this really complex topic?
Yeah, actually, Micah and Christina and Amanda, I am the part of the migrants. I am the inside migrants of the people from South Sulawesi. And for 5 years, currently, when I go to my hometown, I follow their roads, how the people or the workers from South Sulawesi going back to their hometown using the ship from Samarinda to Parepare, and also by sea transport, and also using the public transportation, the car from the port of Parepare to their hometown, especially from Bone, Maros, and some of the regency in South Sulawesi. I call my methodology as a self-ethnography or deep observation, where I come to their community and also to be the part of them. And especially one of the advantage for me is I can speak to them with local languages, and we can discuss each other, doing that, not depth interview, but depth interaction, depth dialogue, and also from heart to heart empathy. I can express my empathy to them, and also my interest as a part of them, where I am the lecturer and also a young man that follow them as migrants. But the challenges is about how to identify or categorize the motive and also the patterns of migration. And because there are many varieties, there are many characteristics why they do the migration, and also how to practice the migration from South Sulawesi to Kalimantan, because there is how to say, the permanent migrants, and also there is the semi-permanent. They can go around and return regularly, maybe one times each year or 2 times, and also they are every month because they are the traders. So how to identify their motive and patterns of migration, and also when we relate to the livelihoods and smallholders, is this is the challenge, I think. And for me, for 5 years, I can interact with them with doing depth observation, and also what I call as a self-ethnography as a part of them in the inside. So that's all, Micah.
Really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Amanda, how about you?
Hi, everyone. So I guess I would answer this in 2 ways, or think about it in 2 ways. I don't know that I have definitive answers because I'm still learning about it. But it seems like we're sort of talking about methods as both ways of knowing and and kind of the stories we can tell with different kinds of data, different kinds of methods or evidence. So as not a counter, but also maybe in a weird way, a complement to Nasrullah's perspective as an emic scholar who has also experienced and navigated migration and mobility. I am a very conspicuous outsider in the field where I do my work, and found that with respect to navigating, I showed you pictures of these the internal borders, right, that are variously manned by police, armed military police. My face is a passport everywhere. Christina, you may have similar experiences. Micah, you might have similar experiences. And so when my partner, who also does field work, and our very close collaborator, and I would drive our truck through towns, it would fill. People from different villages would fill. So we'd leave a community and everybody knew that if I was in the car, we wouldn't get stopped. So there was no feeling, there was no actual witnessing, right? I could never witness necessarily what people explained to me about their experiences at these internal border checkpoints because they never stopped. And yet at the same time, the fact that people kept saying, no, because of who you are in this place, we could sort of use you, I don't know if I should be saying this on a recorded webinar, I could smuggle people across internal borders. It might be illegal, but it's not immoral. I will go on record saying that. At the same time, in these offices, the employés, right, these district offices that people in uniforms occupy these spaces, and I also had an unfair advantage because of who I am in relationship to institutional power and Western power and racial power, that I was able to access certain officials who control those checkpoints and make decisions about who gets to move and how, and do interviews with them. So I think it's not necessarily, I'm not saying we should, mobilize different, well, maybe I am saying we could think about who we are in relationship to the questions we're asking, so that we know that the evidence that we gather, of course, is limited to the kinds of stories that people might tell us. And I don't begrudge anyone for in a context where I have unfair privilege of maybe not telling me the whole story all the time. And the other thing I would say simply is that I went into survey research quite skeptically. So Miju, who I showed the picture of initially, she said, we don't need actually any more Westerners working on citizenship. We know our stories. Well, we actually need a survey data. We need a big study. We can tell stories. We need a big study. And that really kind of caught me off guard. But I went to Cornell and I did dissertation research using survey analysis, being quite skeptical of it as an instrument, and then found that in fact it is quite powerful, about a way of representing, although quite limited in its capacity to represent in a replete, nourished way experience. It is quite powerful in addressing and speaking to institutional power around a kind of how many for how long sorts of questions. So I'm sort of a methodology anarchist, and like what methods can help us kind of tell very particular stories, but always rooted in a what is the purpose of the research and the solidarities that we're building, so that methods are in service of a kind of North Star, an ethical North Star. I at least try in that way.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, go ahead if you have more to add.
No, I was going to say I'll end there.
Okay, excellent. So we're right into the Q&A period. We're getting some Q&A questions in the Q&A. It addresses something that has really changed the patterns of migration in the last couple of years, which is the pandemic, right? So, how do each of you see disruptions or accelerations or changes that happened associated? Were there patterns that emerged during the pandemic? And alongside that, was this sudden reverse migration, did that change people's livelihood strategies in the sending regions? So the question was directed to Christina for Maros, but I think it applies to all of us. And I think we can start with Christina and go around.
Yeah, certainly. That's a really great question, and I'm going to do my best to speak to it. I think when we began this research, we sort of expected to go back into these rural places and hear stories of everyone returning home, and there being an influx of people returning to the farm. And I guess that was kind of a bit of a narrative that was around at the time. I can't say we exactly found that at all. And I guess we're still sort of working to unravel why that is and what was really going on. Yeah, we certainly, at least in Maros, didn't encounter this big mass return of people to the farm. So that's kind of an interesting, just kind of finding that we're still trying to investigate a little bit further. In terms of, I guess, what we did see is this disruption between, at least at that regional scale, a lot of people in Maros, their proximity to Makassar means that they travel in and out of Makassar as daily commuters. It was that sort of everyday mobility that was quite disrupted. A lot of factories sort of laying off staff, cutting costs during COVID, and that sort of really disrupted, that daily mobility. I think salaries in a lot of these factories, they just sort of progressively sort of were reduced until it really was so little that it wasn't actually worth the transportation cost to actually turn up for work for some people. Yes, is that?
Yes, great points. And I just to add to that, I know that, you know, it's still something that we it's really difficult to kind of understand, but there were supply chains that were cut off and crop booms of unique crops through new channels that began to emerge throughout the pandemic. So do others, Nasrullah, do you want to try to get to the question of the pandemic?
Yeah, there's the mass returning of migrants when the pandemic occurred in Southeast Asia, especially in Kalimantan. So the workers or the migrants from South Sulawesi is going back to their hometown as maybe back to their smallholders activities like the farmers and the others. And one story when the port of Samarinda is closed by the government because of the pandemic. Many of workers and migrants from South Sulawesi that will return to their hometown is cannot return to their hometown because there is some regulation, especially about the vaccination. But when the port is opened up again, there is a massive workers that are returned to the South Sulawesi from the port of Samarinda, and because the place where they work as a mining worker, many of coal mining is closed in the Samarinda and the town of Kalimantan. That's why the migrants or the workers that came from South Sulawesi is returned to their hometown and return to their smallholder activities. So that's my description about this question.
Great, thanks. Amanda?
So I would put this as a tentative finding because we're still working on this sort of question, getting a handle on the ways that COVID impacted mobility, migration, and livelihoods. But a couple of things were clear quite early. And one, at least initially from the Highland perspective, and then I'll mention some work that I've done in other communities. For Highland communities, they actually responded by sending crops surplus to construction sites in areas where Indigenous people had moved in a broader network. Indigenous people had moved out of villages and moved into cities. So working in construction, working in the construction sites were very hard hit during COVID because they were sites where people not only had difficulty accessing state care, but also they were sites where, of course, there's higher rates of transmission. People were quite sick often. So again, essentially landless, and sometimes stateless Highlanders who had a degree of food security in the village were sending surplus into areas where other migrants, either from those communities or from Myanmar, perhaps less from Laos, were really struggling. So that was quite amazing. And from my understanding with my partners, research and advocacy partners, they were really proud of their ability to respond to that need and address food insecurity, quite rampant food insecurity well. Another thing that seems to have arisen, although I don't want to say this is definitive, but it did seem that, at least in communities where men in particular had come home and were staying, and there's just not the kind of work at home wasn't as exciting as work they had been doing, and certainly not as lucrative as work they'd been doing in other areas. So very high rates of depression and sometimes kind of internal domestic and internal conflict in communities where I'd never witnessed this, but then started to see this. But the other thing I think that's worth noting in the context of Thailand, but I think perhaps Cambodia, and then I'm curious about how this is working in Laos, is the way that the state, so Thailand is both a sending country and also a destination country in the region, and it has partly in relationship to these documentation and internal border patrols, the ID regime, the kind of broad regime of surveillance of non-citizen residents in the country is huge in Thailand. And so people who are not Thai citizens and are originally born in Thailand, even if they're Highlander citizens, right, experienced COVID as, and the people I know who, occupy those states of extraordinary precarity, experienced COVID as a moment of pretty intense state surveillance. In a broader moment of intense state surveillance, people have to apply regularly for permits to stay. They have to constantly show themselves, but the state sort of mobilized or weaponized its extensive public health, makes an extraordinary public health system as a way to continue to kind of encroach on non-citizen residents in the country. And the kind of full extent of that isn't clear, but it's something that we're looking at because it is concerning. I mean, Thailand has an extraordinary and quite inclusive, globally, renowned public health system, and to see it sort of be incorporated into a surveillance infrastructure of migrants is obviously quite concerning. So that's something we're kind of looking at.
Great, thanks. Really, really interesting viewpoints. Participating in this webinar is giving me whiplash just thinking about, all the complexity that's going on from each of these cases and such. I want to ask the next question, which is looking forward beyond the pandemic and kind of the world resettling into the whatever it is now, and the motivations that compel people to migrate. But to flip the question a little bit, to think about when people migrate, do they have in their minds that they will come back? Is there some sort of idea of a homeland? How do migrants think about the return? I know you've alluded to this, go out, buy land, come home. That's kind of the simplistic story that we often hear about, but obviously things change along the way. Can each of you comment a little bit on that? Christina, sorry to make you lead off every time. We just agreed to a lineup, so it's just, yeah.
No, certainly. Yes, I'll have a go at that, and interested to hear what the others say. I guess, again, just to remind you that we really were working in one area. We weren't in the destination site. So when we spoke to people about migration, we were speaking with people that had returned. And so that biases things a lot. And but I guess what we found is that those that return, there is this connection to rural village life for a lot of people. And I think that still does actually remain strong. so many young people explained how expensive it was migrating, how the salaries just weren't quite what they thought they would be, or even if they were, just the cost of living is so high. So you might earn more, but you spend so much on food and accommodation. And they started to wonder, is this really worth it? And I think those ideas around, you know, when I'm in the village, I can just eat the crops and life is cheap. People, yeah, it was nice. And even just the relaxing, people spoke about how village life is relaxing and calm, and that you might also prefer to raise your family back in the village. That was another thing that some people mentioned. Yeah, so that's sort of the ideas around returning home. There was something else, but it's just slipped my mind. But in saying that, again, it would be a different perspective if we had conducted this research in East Kalimantan. But there are also challenges. We spoke with one young woman who had followed with her parents to East Kalimantan, and she had done most of her formal schooling in she'd actually gone to Malaysia, and she conducted most of her schooling in Malaysia, so on the in Borneo on oil palm plantations. And she said, returning back to Indonesia, she felt that her language skills weren't quite as good for Indonesian schools, and she was just struggling socially to reconnect and to refit into life in Indonesia. So I think, that's another one. It's not just the people that migrate for work. They often bring families, children with them. And so maybe the parents wanted to return back to their rural village, but it was quite disruptive for the children who had found this new life in Malaysia and become connected there. So that's just some views. I'll pass on now to...
Great.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nasrullah. Tell us what your experience with that question is.
Okay, Micah. I divide the types of migrants from South Sulawesi, Kalimantan, and especially the other one, space in archipelagos. The old migrants remains to stay and not seeing to return to their hometown. But the new migrants return regularly, especially when the pandemic or the decrease of economic activities in the destinations, especially in eastern of Kalimantan. So the migrants like me and my generation still have the tie or the connection with my hometowns. But the old migrants that migrate to the Kalimantan because of the conflicts or riots mostly remains to stay in their destination and never think to going back again for the next time, for the future. But like me, the new migrants remains to return regularly, especially in holiday like Idul Fitri and Lebaran for the Muslim, and after the Idul Fitri or Idul Adha, or when our family have the activities or have the parties in our hometown, we can return regularly or remain to return. I think that. Okay.
Great points. We just had a question. Well, let's go, Amanda. Let's hear your perspectives on that. I imagine there's similarities and differences.
Well, a few, and I'm really struck by both of your responses, Christina and Nazrul, and I have follow-up questions for you on your points too. The only thing I was going to add is that because I focused the component of my work specifically on Highland dimensions, which is quite unique, despite the fact that there's this history of structural exclusion and statelessness and landlessness, it's become, certain communities have become sites of kind of extraordinary wealth accumulation and cosmopolitan kind of I mean, I should say these communities have always been quite cosmopolitan to the extent that they've been a part of larger global trading routes. But the kind of participation in coffee culture and things like this is sort of interesting. So 15 years ago, nobody wanted to go home. Everybody was saying, you know, they wanted to leave, they wanted to go to school. They saw, you know, there's just diminishing futures in the village, and the only people who stay in the village are people who can't leave. So there was also a kind of stigmatization of staying in the community when in fact related to someone's citizenship status. And now in certain areas, particularly Doichang, in Chiang Rai and certain tourist sites in Maehongshan, you see college-educated Highland kids who could work in, you know, they're not just college-educated, you know, I'm very close with a young woman who is a talented occupational therapist and worked in a Bangkok hospital and has decided being home where she can take care of her parents, as she's expected to do as an unmarried youngest daughter. She has this training that allows her to do this work with elderly folks in the community, and maybe build a small tourism homestay and coffee company there. Is like she sees a future there, but it's not a future that is imagined in the way that Christina was talking about, that there's like, oh, there's a kind of calm in the community. Like a lot of the youth are saying what we want to do is sort of energize the community with these new possibilities, which is very new and really interesting. But I also think that the answer is gendered, like that a lot of women have found that living in the community, when you do fulfill certain expectations about what women in the community are supposed to do, they're like, why would I do that? I have to be up at 4 a.m. I have to be, you know, the expectations of what a woman in the village does versus what I would do is, you know, working in an even low paid or not well paid industry in the city. A lot of young women also think they prefer not to go home. And so you see disproportionate younger men returning and sort of staying longer term and working in the fields. I can't, again, say I don't have survey data on those. So I can't say the extent to which my, you know, networks and interviews with folks reflect a broader pattern, but that's been really interesting and honestly quite surprising given just the scale of change. But it's also a site where people have, I think many Highland communities, in particular people in their 40s and up, remember very well when the state would violently enforce certain kinds of forestry acts, or for instance, just enforce the border. So people now with the growing insurgency and the war again and you know, accelerating in Myanmar, and people fleeing Myanmar and coming and seeking refuge in these communities with ethnic kin, people in their 40s and up are remembering, you know, when the Shan army or the Burmese army, when they were children, used to come in and take all their pigs. So they remember village life also as quite precarious, and going home doesn't always feel like it's sure. They don't have land rights, so there's that too.
Great. That's a perfect segue into this next question, which is directed specifically at Nasrullah. And I just want to say it's so interesting that when Christina, you know, I guess we're a product of our research sites, right? When Christina says we haven't had a chance to talk to anybody who, you know, has stayed, only know the perspectives of the people who have returned. And Nasrullah is saying, well, these are the people, everybody that I've interacted with are the people that stayed. So it's this interesting kind of complement of different perspectives. I do want to raise this question from Dainik Sulius Darini, specific to Nasrullah's presentation, but I think it applies to all of us. In terms of this point about new identities that you made of the migrants from South Sulawesi to Kalimantan, can you talk a little bit about these new identities, similar in the way that Amanda just did, but what are the new identities of people who have chosen to stay, and maybe talk a little bit about what their linkages are to home of being Bugis or Makassar?
Okay, thank you for the question from Danik Sulistiarini. about the new identities in eastern of Kalimantan that people from come to South Sulawesi, as I call, or people call people from South Sulawesi, especially in the intern of Bugis people call as Bugis Samarinda or Bugis Kute or Bugis Balikpapan. This is the new identities for people that remains that their descendants or their parents or their grandfather and grandmother come from South Sulawesi, but they born in Kalimantan, but still identify themselves as a Bugis, but most of them cannot speak Bugis or Makassaris, and people of in the Bugis and Makassaris communities call them as Bugis Samarinda or Balikpapan or Kutai, because they identify themselves as about that. I am the Bugis, but I'm staying in Samarinda, so I am the Bugis of Samarinda, and differentiate themselves from the people like me that the people or the migrant that come from South Sulawesi, but still a newcomer. This is the identification of, I think, the all migrants of the frontiers of migrants from South Sulawesi that remains to stay in Kalimantan and maybe never think to going back or return or going back going back to their hometown in South Sulawesi. Yeah, I think that's all, Mika.
It's a great point. This dimension of language is particularly interesting, how dynamic language can be and how that, self-identifies different groups at points of origins and also differentiates generations, right? New people born in new places that come up with different languages. Amanda, do you want to comment on that point a little bit?
Can you hear me? Oh, yes. Okay. The only thing I would add is that I've noticed, and I will put in the chat for everyone because I actually just want to make sure that other people get to find this person's research. So a collaborator who's an Aka anthropologist and works in China, he and I were observing that the language of the Thai state's migration regime is increasingly being incorporated by people as a means of identifying in Aka with one another. And in terms of practice, this regime, the idea of a passport itself or documents as a way of saying who you are, this is who I am, that language is being incorporated in kind of long-standing customs of welcoming a visitor to a village, joking about passports, asking about identities, and using a sort of state framework of foreigner, visitor, resident, alien. The term alien in Thai is Nang Dao, which is literally means a different star. You're from a different star. That language is being incorporated in both Aka language, but also customs of welcoming people, and that's Nazrullah, your points really reminded me of that. It's really interesting and raises a number of questions. So
thanks.
I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to say anything else.
Thanks so much. I want to give just the last word to Christina before we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can add much to that. I think what's been said is, it's really great.
Okay. Sounds good. I just we have 2 minutes remaining and we want to respect everybody's time, so we always end on time. I just want to say what a wonderful discussion this has been. Again, there's just so much to contend with when it comes to this complex issue of migration and how it relates to smallholders in particular, how smallholders are changing, the definitions of what a smallholder is, which we talked about so extensively in our last session of this webinar series, and how that's playing out in different places, how that changes over time. across different classes, genders, generations, and the new forms of identity that's creating, the different political economies that are involved in places where you have lots of smallholders or frontier areas, as Nasrullah mentioned, where so much natural resource change and development is happening. The creation of the capital city in Indonesia, in East Kalimantan, and things like that. And Amanda, thanks so much for all the different insights. Those stories are really vivid from that region about how these people are connected from the highlands to the different processes over time, as well as where the destinations of migration and the hopes of young people going forward is such an interesting topic. We will finish. This is a part of a series, so I do want in my waning moments here to let everybody know that we will be having our next session, which will shift gears a little bit, still focus around issues of smallholders, but looking at ecological changes around human-animal conflict, large animal loss, and issues like that, but also very much tied into smallholders. So stay tuned. We hope you keep in touch with us. Hope you check out the archives of really great conversations like this one. And I hope you all have enjoyed it. And thanks all for those that asked questions, really wonderful questions on a really important subject. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Aloha.
Thanks, everyone.